Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of Myself, canto passage number 49. Now we have said that these last cantos are the crescendo to this amazing song that he has constructed. This view of the what we call integralist pedagogy. And now we're going to find ourselves returning back to passage number 6, which for many readers is, of course, that most famous passage where the child comes to the adult and says, "What is this thing called grass?" And the speaker will ultimately get around to the beautiful uncut hair of graves, to death itself. So we're going to talk now in this canto about Whitman's view of death and afterlife. We've in the previous section of 48 talked about his views of theology and God. In the previous 46 and 47 we talked about his views of school and learning and reading. You can see how he's knocking down some of the major topics. Now, as we've said in 303 for a long time, it's true there are not a lot of absolutes in life, but there are a couple that are for sure. The only way you got here is two people hooked up and exchanged fluids. Whitman obviously makes that point repeatedly. And of course the other absolute is you ain't met no 200-year-old people. Why is that? Yeah, right, because the only difference between you and a fly is you know about fly swatters. The only difference between you and a bird is that you know about BBs, to borrow, of course, from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The idea is quite simply this. We know we only get to stay at the park and swing for a few hours, and then we got to go bye-bye to the van. We don't want to go bye-bye to the van, but we have to. Well, how do you deal with that? And a lot of readers of Leaves of Grass have said this is where they find their greatest comfort, in Whitman's rendering and treatment of death and dying. Now, reminding you, the key line from passage 4 is both in and out of the game. We're going to play around with the idea of game as death and life, and watching and wondering at it. No question about the wondering at it. I witness and wait. And we're going to see a lot of that witnessing that's happening here. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, the 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections of starting from Paumanok, and I hope that you watched our intro lecture to Song of Myself, and then all the way up through passage 48. Again, his radical views on education and God are now followed with his radical views of afterlife. Now, of course, we know there are a lot of famous poems, maybe none more famous than John Donne's Sonnet 10, Death Be Not Proud. We've given full lectures on that one at learnstrong.net. Here, we're going to get Whitman's take on that passage, Sonnet number 10, passage 49. As to you, death, and you, bitter hug of mortality, it's idle to try to alarm me. To his work without flinching, the accoucher comes. I see the elder hand pressing, receiving, supporting. I recline by the sills of the exquisite, flexible floors. I mark the outlet and mark the relief and escape. And as to you, corpse, I think you're good manure, but that does not offend me. I smell the white roses, sweet-scented and growing. I reach to the leafy lips. I reach to the polished breasts of melons. And as to you, life, I reckon you're the leavings of many deaths. No doubt I've died myself 10,000 times before. I hear you whispering there, O stars of heaven, O suns, O grass of graves, O perpetual transfers and promotions. If you do not say anything, how can I say anything? Of the turbid pool that lies in the autumn forest, of the moon that descends the steeps of the soughing twilight. Toss, sparkles of day and dusk, toss on the black stems that decay in the muck. Toss to the moaning gibberish of the dry limbs. I ascend from the moon, I ascend from the night. I perceive that the ghastly glimmer is noonday sunbeams reflected, and debouche to the steady and central from the offspring great or small. Now, the echoes, as we said, are amazing. And as I said to you, I don't think you can read T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets without a real appreciation of Whitman. Those echoes from Bert Norton, my words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden. How about these for echoes from passage number 6, as we said? What do you think's become of the young and old men? And what do you think's become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if there ever was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it and cease the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses, and the die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. So what Whitman does at the end of the Song of Myself is to come back to those lines and speak directly to death, the way that John Donne, of course, will. As to you, death, by the way, capitalized in the deathbed edition, not in the 55 edition. It'll be interesting what he capitalizes. He capitalizes death and corpse and life as he speaks directly to them. And you, bitter hug of mortality. Isn't it interesting how we're getting these echoes? Hug, embrace. Go back and look how many times that notion has been presented. It is idle to try to alarm me, useless to try to make me fear. This takes us back to passage 48, right? No amount of words can say how at peace I am about God and about death. In other words, he says, I've already got this figured out. I do not need to be worried about these things. To his work, without flinching, the accoucher, the midwife, the one who provides life, right, comes. I see the elder hand pressing, receiving, supporting. Notice your trinities, your threes. I recline. This is a beautiful set of lines. Reminds us of Thomas Wolfe's great line from the Four Last Men. I recline by the sills of the exquisite flexible floors and mark the outlet and mark the relief and escape. What a brilliant poetic way to talk about birthing. In the same way that birthing is in some ways a whole lot like dying. Transformations of a kind, right? And as to you, corpse, he literally talks to the corpse as if the corpse has a certain kind of resonance or capacity to understand. I think you're good manure, but that does not offend me. Back to doesn't alarm me, doesn't offend me. Hey, think about how clearly Whitman was very influenced by somebody like Shakespeare, and especially Hamlet's musings on death in both Act 4 as well as Act 5. We've given full lectures on the play. You can find it at learnstrong.net. But it is compelling. What is it that he says to Yorick's skull in 4:1? Get thee to my lady's chamber and tell her to paint it on an inch thick. This is what she gets to come to. Of course, not realizing he's standing right next to his lady's chamber because Ophelia's soon to be buried in that hole in the ground. He says, you're good manure, but I'm not offended by that because I smell the white roses, sweet-scented and growing. This makes a lot of sense given that the title of the book is called Leaves of Grass, right? We got all these growing imagery. Out of the manure of corpses rises the sweet-scented roses. It's a brilliant word picture. I reach, wow, this is going to sound very erotic, and it's going to sound very much like taking us back to passage 5. I reach to the leafy lips. I reach to the polished breasts of melons. It's an amazing thing how we got erotic language about death here in just compelling ways. Takes us back to passage 5. And now, after he goes from corpse, he goes to life. After he goes from death, he goes to corpse, he goes to life. And as to you, life, and then using a very American kind of language, I reckon you are the leavings of many deaths, leaves of grass. See, I told you when we started playing around with this title that we would see it on so many levels, so many allusions to so many different things. The leavings of many deaths. And then, although not in parentheses in the 55, in the deathbed edition now with parentheses, no doubt I have died myself 10,000 times before. And of course we cannot read lines like this without thinking about lines from W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium that we love so much. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless so clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter on its mortal dress. I hear you whispering there, and then sounding very much like starting from Paumanok 19. Remember all those O's, O's, O's at the end? Here we're going to get 4 of them in a row. I hear you whispering there, oh, stars of heaven, oh, suns, oh, grass of graves. Again, passage 6, as well as, of course, leaves of grass, right? Oh, perpetual transfers and promotions, a moving forward, promotions, right? If you do not say anything, how can I say anything? In other words, the rhetorical question that leads to a certain understanding of death is translinguistic. Can't really talk about it, right? Then, repetition of anaphoria of 2 ofs. Of the turbid pool, we can't help but think of turbid in Dover Beach, Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. Of the turbid pool that lies in the autumn forest. Of course, autumn giving us the sense of death and dying, right? All of this makes us think, of course, of a poem like Keats's Nightingale, right? autumn forest, of the moon that descends the steeps, of the soughing or moaning, right, twilight, toss, sparkles of day and dusk. Notice repetition of the word toss here. And with this sparkles, we think about the dazzle of the light in 46, right? Toss, sparkles of day and dusk. Toss on the black stems that decay in the muck. Think about how the word decay has been used already in Leaves of Grass and will continue to do so. Decay in the muck. Toss, the third toss, to the moaning, back to soughing, moaning gibberish of the dry limbs. In other words, what's being seen here is all of the life that once was life, that becomes death, somehow subsumed in this mucky pool, and yet out of all of this will come, what? New growth, new life. Now we're going to get our rising kinds of imagery. I ascend from the moon. I ascend from the night. Notice the repetitions. And there's a certain kind of rhythmic beauty to this. I perceive, it's all about perspicacity in our Plato study, right? That the ghastly glimmer, the repetition of the G sound, is noonday sunbeams reflected. In other words, death is life. They are one and the same. They are synonymous with each other. And debouche, that is to say, he starts with a French word and he ends with a French word. This idea of somehow emerging or coming out of the mouth. And debouche to the steady and central from the offspring. Could be point of departure. It could be, of course, all of those previous births, great or small. And immediately we think about Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Okay, what's being said here? What's being suggested? Well, at 2a, life and death are circles. They're synonymous, right? And for every breath that you're taking right now, there's an end and then a beginning and a new one. If that is true, then why is it that we fear death? Of course, if we are in fact energy, and we say that energy is that which can be neither created, what do we say, nor destroyed, and that's what you are. Oh, so you don't exist. No, definitely exist. Dude, you just said it can't be created or destroyed. Yeah, see, that's that translinguistic thing. It's kind of like you got to have a mind to argue you don't have a mind, right? But if it's true that you're energy and you can't be created or destroyed, then why do we fear dying? Why do we fear death if we can't be destroyed? This is the point that he makes here. At 2b, I just want to point out his use of these two French words, and both of them, the accoutre as well as debouche, they play around with the idea of bringing forth or emerging in some way. At 3a, well, we've mentioned John Donne and Sonnet 10. You can't help but think of Emerson and Thoreau and Emily Dickinson. So many other writers of this time period were also playing around with this question of, what are you going to do with the whole notion of death and dying? Finally, at 3b, how are we going to own a passage like this? Well, I think it's a good question to ask. So, you ain't met no 200-year-old people. What do you do with an idea like that? And you don't get to swing at the park for very long. The van's waiting. What do you do with an idea like that? Can you gain some sense of comfort? I mean, Whitman wants you to gain some sense of comfort from lines like that. And it will be from passage 49 that we then turn to the last three cantos of Song of Myself. And there will be a certain kind of, we said crescendo, a certain kind of great joy that will come out of, an optimism that will come out of these last few passages where Whitman, as a radical thinker, is challenging in iconoclastic ways the traditional ways of thinking about stuff. Now, it was Percy Shelley who said, the great Percy Bysshe Shelley, who said in his defense of poetry, that what great poets do is they take the simple and they somehow make it sublime. You see and hear new things again, and of course he plays that game in Ode to the West Wind as well as to a Skylark. And we'll play the similar kind of game here as we finish with Song of Myself. Congratulations, you are now moving to the final three cantos. Well done. Thank you.